Victoria Harper boarded the private jet with the practiced grace of someone who understood her every movement would be observed, judged, and dissected. The cabin, bathed in muted golden light, reeked of exclusivity, of privilege she had fought for in more ways than one. Each plush seat, each polished brass fixture seemed to echo a silent assurance to its passengers, "You belong here." But as Victoria moved to her assigned seat, the silent assurance faltered. It wasn't in the opulence or the architecture, but in the gaze of the flight attendant, a slim blonde woman named Claire who stood at the front of the cabin with a clipboard in hand. Claire's smile was a practiced thing, clipped on like a badge of protocol. To the passengers who filed in before Victoria, it shone bright, full of warm pleasantries, but when her eyes settled on Victoria, the smile dimmed, not abruptly, but with the subtlety of a door creaking closed. Victoria felt the shift instantly. Like a splinter beneath the skin, she had learned, over decades of subtle humiliations, to notice what wasn't said, to read between the lines of what was missing. Claire's greeting was perfunctory, her tone clipped, as if dispensing kindness to Victoria would be an unnecessary strain. Victoria's voice, smooth as silk, held its ground. "Good evening." Claire's response was a brief nod, her smile already directed at the next passenger. Victoria slid into her seat, her movements deliberate, her posture composed. She had known this dance for most of her life. Racism, she had realized long ago, did not always come with snarling faces and slurs. It often came wrapped in faint hesitations, in fleeting glances, in an almost imperceptible distance that widened until it became an uncrossable gulf. Across the aisle, a young woman with dark hair and inquisitive eyes had been watching. She smiled faintly, almost apologetically, and turned to her laptop. Victoria noticed the woman's hesitance to hold her gaze for too long. A reminder that even allies often lived in the shadow of their own discomfort. Victoria reached into her bag, pulling out a book she had been longing to read. But before she could turn the first page, Claire reappeared, gliding through the cabin with a tray of drinks. Her demeanor, as she spoke to other passengers, was effervescent, brimming with care. "Would you like sparkling water? Orange juice? A glass of Chardonnay?" When Claire reached Victoria, her voice flattened. A single glass of water landed on the tray table with a faint but deliberate clink. "Your drink," Claire said, her eyes momentarily meeting Victoria's before darting away. Victoria offered a gracious smile, the kind that held firm against an undertow of insult. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." Claire's response was not verbal. Instead, it was a faint smirk, so quick it could have been imagined. She retreated toward the galley, her back straight, her pace measured, leaving behind the faintest tremor in the atmosphere. An hour into the flight, Victoria remained poised, but unease gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Across the aisle, the young woman leaned over, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said. "I couldn't help but notice how that flight attendant treated you." Victoria closed her book, her calm voice masking the weight of her irritation. "She's just doing her job." The woman hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her laptop. "I overheard her talking to another attendant near the galley. She mentioned you specifically. I thought you should know." Victoria's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened slightly. "Thank you for telling me." The woman Lydia, as Victoria would later learn, nodded and returned to her seat. Victoria leaned back, her mind moving faster than the jet itself. It wasn't the first time she had been singled out, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But there was something in Claire's demeanor, a sharpness, an intent that unsettled her. By the second hour, Claire's actions grew bolder. She moved through the cabin with the precision of someone who knew how to wield power subtly but effectively. A passenger in the front row received a warm laugh and an extra blanket. A few rows back were offered a second glass of wine. When Claire reached Victoria again, she paused, clipboard in hand. "Are you sure your booking information was verified properly?" The question hung in the air, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Heads turned slightly, curiosity and unease flickering in their expressions. Victoria met Claire's gaze, her calm voice steady as stone. "Yes, it was. Is there an issue?" Claire raised an eyebrow, her tone thinly veiled. "We just want to ensure all passengers are properly accounted for." Victoria placed her book down deliberately, folding her hands in her lap. "If you need further verification, feel free to contact my office." I assure you, everything is in order. Claire's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it carried none of its warmth. I'll make sure. She turned on her heel, retreating toward the galley with a pace just shy of hurried. The tension in the cabin thickened. The small acts of exclusion were growing into something larger, more deliberate. Lydia leaned toward Victoria once again, her whisper urgent. She's up to something. You need to be careful. Victoria nodded faintly. I've faced worse, she murmured, though her eyes betrayed a deeper worry. She had spent a lifetime confronting this quiet, insidious hostility, but something about this moment felt heavier, more orchestrated. She glanced toward the galley, where muted whispers reached her ears. Fragments of words, not safe. Verify. Report. Flickered in and out of the air like faint embers of a fire yet to ignite. Victoria leaned back in her seat, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin ceiling as if searching for answers hidden in the soft glow of its lights. She knew the rhythm of these confrontations. They started small, a glance, a tone, a question, but they rarely stayed small for long. Injustice had a way of growing, feeding off silence and complicity, until it demanded to be reckoned with. And Victoria was already preparing for the reckoning to come. The cabin was a theater of muted discomfort. The passengers, confined to their seats, exchanged glances but remained silent. Victoria Harper had learned long ago that silence was a force of its own. Heavier and more complicit than words. It could hold you down like an anchor or strangle you like an unseen noose. Claire returned to the aisle, her movements deliberate, her presence looming over the rows of passengers. The faint clatter of her shoes against the plush carpet carried an unsettling rhythm, each step echoing the quiet but growing tension. She stopped abruptly at Victoria's seat. Mrs. Harper, Claire began, her voice measured, almost saccharine in its pretense of professionalism. I'll need to see your identification again. Victoria folded her hands calmly on her lap, her gaze steady. I provided my documents when I boarded. They were verified. Is there an issue I should be aware of? Claire hesitated, but only for a moment. It's just standard procedure, she said, her words hollow, designed to shield her intent. The surrounding passengers shifted in their seats, their curiosity tinged with unease. Victoria reached for her bag, extracting her identification with deliberate movements. Handing it over, she spoke quietly but with a sharp edge. Standard procedures are for everyone, aren't they? Claire's smile faltered, her hand gripping the identification tightly before retreating toward the galley. Victoria knew her question would not be answered because it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be felt. Across the aisle, Lydia leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. She's pushing this too far, she said. Her tone carried the righteous indignation of someone who had long believed that wrongs should be righted immediately. You don't have to take this. Victoria smiled faintly. And what would you suggest I do? This isn't just about me. Lydia frowned, unsure how to respond. Victoria appreciated her concern but knew the weight of such moments. This wasn't a confrontation to win with force. It was a slow, grinding process, one she had endured her entire life. The plane jolted slightly as turbulence rippled through the cabin. As the passengers steadied themselves, Claire re-emerged, this time with a male flight attendant trailing behind her. He was younger, quieter, his presence less imposing but no less complicit. Mrs. Harper, Claire said, her voice louder now, drawing more attention than before. We've reviewed your documentation. For the safety of this flight, we may need you to disembark at the next stop. The words were like a knife to the air, slicing through the already fragile silence. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Lydia shot to her feet. This is absurd. Lydia's voice trembled with anger. She's done nothing wrong, and you know it. Claire turned to Lydia, her expression cold. Ma'am, I'd ask you to remain seated. This matter does not concern you. Lydia scoffed, refusing to sit. It concerns all of us when someone is being singled out like this. It's discrimination, plain and simple. Victoria raised a hand, motioning for Lydia to sit. It's all right, she said softly, though her tone carried the weight of an unspoken command. Lydia hesitated but obeyed, her expression stormy. Victoria turned her gaze back to Claire, her voice calm but razor-sharp. If there's a safety concern, I suggest you involve the captain. Otherwise, I expect to remain seated, as any passenger should. Claire opened her mouth to respond but stopped short. The male flight attendant behind her shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the growing scrutiny of the passengers around them. Claire turned abruptly, retreating once again to the galley. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Victoria leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing against the armrest as her mind raced. This was not an isolated incident. She had seen this before. In restaurants, in boardrooms, in neighborhoods where her presence was treated as an anomaly. An intrusion. The passengers around her whispered, their words a mix of sympathy and fear. Fear of speaking out, fear of being next. Victoria understood their silence, but it stung nonetheless. When Claire returned, she brought reinforcements, another flight attendant and, this time, a member of the cockpit crew. Mrs. Harper, Claire began again, her tone icier than before. We've made arrangements for you to disembark at the next stop. This is non-negotiable. Victoria stood slowly, her movements deliberate, her expression unyielding. She did not speak immediately, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Then, her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the tension. Why? She asked. Claire blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. For the safety of the flight, she repeated, her voice less certain now. And what makes me a threat to this flight? Victoria's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every passenger who dared to look at her. Is it my demeanor? My presence? My skin? The cabin fell silent. Even Claire could not respond. Victoria slowly lowered herself back into her seat. If you wish to remove me, you will need to explain to everyone here why I am a threat. Not just to me, to them. The challenge was clear, and Claire faltered, her authority cracking under the weight of scrutiny. Without a word, she retreated once more. Lydia leaned toward Victoria, her whisper urgent. They're going to try something. Be ready. Victoria nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on the galley door. She had no doubt that the confrontation was far from over. She also knew that the fight she was facing, like so many before it, was not just about her. It was about the weight of silence, the complicity of bystanders, and the unspoken truths that divided the world she lived in. And she was prepared to carry that weight, no matter how heavy it became. The announcement came over the intercom like a stone dropping into water, sending ripples of unease throughout the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen technical issues, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions. Victoria Harper's fingers tightened around the armrest of her seat. The phrasing was professional, the tone even, but she knew the truth rarely announced itself in full. Her years of experience had taught her that beneath the polished surface of civility, there was often a more jagged reality waiting to emerge. Across the aisle, Lydia's expression darkened. She leaned toward Victoria. You know this isn't a coincidence. Victoria nodded faintly, her eyes fixed ahead. No, it isn't. The murmurs among the passengers grew as the plane began its descent. Confusion mingled with concern, but no one openly challenged the situation. Victoria watched as Claire moved through the cabin, her steps brisk, her expression tight with determination. This was not the casual stride of someone performing their duties, it was the march of someone executing a plan. As Claire reached Victoria's row, she stopped abruptly. Her voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of authority. Mrs. Harper, once we land, I'll need you to gather your belongings and disembark immediately. The statement was delivered flatly, as if it were a mere formality, a logical step in a sequence only Claire understood. Victoria looked up at her, unflinching. And why would that be necessary? For the safety of the flight, Claire replied, her tone as rehearsed as a line in a poorly written play. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the plane's engines. Passengers turned their heads, their curiosity now sharpened by the unmistakable scent of conflict. Victoria's voice cut through the tension, steady and clear. If my presence is a threat, then I deserve to know why. Safety is not an abstract concept, Miss. It requires specifics. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure wavering under the weight of Victoria's gaze. We'll discuss it on the ground, she said curtly before turning away. The plane landed at a small, desolate airstrip, its surroundings barren and unfamiliar. As the aircraft taxied to a halt, Victoria felt the cabin's atmosphere tighten. The passengers were silent now, their discomfort palpable. When the door opened, the air that rushed in was dry and warm, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt baking in the sun. Claire appeared again, this time with a member of the ground crew in tow. "Mrs. Harper, this way, please," she said, her voice sharper now, the pretense of politeness abandoned. Victoria stood slowly, her movements deliberate, the weight of every gaze in the cabin pressed against her back as she reached for her bag. Lydia rose from her seat, her voice low but firm. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll go with you." Victoria placed a hand on Lydia's arm, stopping her. "No," she said softly. "Stay. Watch. They will reveal themselves." Victoria stepped into the harsh light of the airstrip, her heels clicking against the pavement. Behind her, the cabin door closed with a finality that felt almost punitive. She stood alone as the plane began to taxi away, its engines roaring to life before it disappeared into the sky. The silence that followed was oppressive. The airstrip was devoid of activity, its facilities worn and abandoned. Victoria's gaze swept the area, taking in the cracked asphalt and the rusted chain link fence in the distance. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and began walking toward the only visible structure, a small, weathered building that looked as though it hadn't been tended to in years. Inside, the air was stale, the space dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. A reception desk sat at the center, its surface cluttered with papers and dust. Victoria approached the desk, searching for any means of communication. Her fingers found an old rotary phone, and she lifted the receiver, pressing it to her ear. Nothing, only static. She set the receiver down and glanced at her cell phone. No service, whether by chance or design. She was cut off, stranded in a place that seemed designed to isolate. As the weight of her predicament settled on her shoulders, Victoria felt a flicker of anger rise within her, a quiet, simmering rage that had been tempered by years of practice but was no less potent. She stepped back outside, the sun now dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty airstrip. In the distance, a narrow path wound its way toward what appeared to be a small settlement, its outlines blurred by the heat rising from the ground. Victoria began walking, her steps steady, her resolve unshaken. The wind rustled through the dry brush that lined the path, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to echo the doubts and fears she refused to entertain. This was no mere inconvenience. It was an act of deliberate isolation, an attempt to strip her of dignity and control. Yet, even as the challenges mounted, Victoria's determination grew. She reached the edge of the settlement as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden glow replaced by the cool tones of twilight. The sound of voices reached her ears, soft laughter, the clinking of dishes, the faint strains of a melody carried on the breeze. A man emerged from one of the small houses, his frame silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the doorway. He approached her with a steady, unhurried gait, his expression kind but curious. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and welcoming. "You look like you've had a rough journey. Is everything all right?" Victoria managed a faint smile, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her. "I've been left stranded," she said simply. "I need to contact my office." The man nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "The signal out here isn't great, but you're welcome to rest here for the night. We'll help you in the morning." Victoria followed him into the house, her steps slower now, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. Yet, as she crossed the threshold, she felt a flicker of warmth, the kind that came not from the room's light, but from the quiet, unassuming kindness of strangers. Her battle was far from over. But for the first time that day, Victoria allowed herself to exhale. The night would bring rest, and the morning would bring resolve. And as the stars emerged above the small settlement, she knew that the truth, buried though it maybe, would not stay hidden forever. Victoria Harper awoke to the soft hum of morning, a distant rooster crowing, the faint laughter of children, and the low murmur of voices just outside her window. The village was alive in its own quiet way, its rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind. For a moment, she let the warmth of the morning wash over her, but the memories of the previous day returned quickly, sharp and unrelenting, as if to remind her that her journey was far from over. She rose, dressed, and stepped outside, where the villagers were already gathering. Their curiosity was palpable but not intrusive. They were kind, not nosy, offering gestures of hospitality rather than questions. Jamal, the village chief, approached her with a calm, steady presence that felt like an anchor in the swirling uncertainty. "We've arranged transport to a nearby town," he said. "From there, You'll find the signal you need to contact your people. Victoria nodded her thanks, though her mind was already moving ahead, calculating the steps she would take once she regained access to her network. I'm grateful, she replied. Your kindness is something I won't forget. The pickup truck that carried Victoria to the town was old and rattled loudly as it moved along the dirt path, kicking up clouds of dust. Jamal sat beside her, his hands firm on the wheel, while a young girl named Amina sat in the truck bed, her wide eyes filled with admiration for the stranger in their midst. Do you often travel alone? Jamal asked, breaking the silence. Not usually, Victoria replied, but circumstances can make even the most ordinary journeys complicated. Jamal nodded knowingly but said nothing further. His silence was not ignorance, it was understanding. The town came into view, its modest buildings standing in defiance of the arid landscape. Victoria stepped out of the truck and immediately felt the stares. The people here were not like the villagers, their gazes carried suspicion, not warmth. She walked with purpose, her head high, but the weight of those eyes pressed down on her shoulders. Inside the small cafe that also served as the town's communication hub, Victoria approached the counter and asked for access to a phone. The young man behind the counter, barely out of his teens, hesitated, glancing around as if seeking approval from the patrons seated at the few scattered tables. Finally, he nodded toward an older man in the corner. Talk to Mr. Cross. He's in charge. Victoria turned, her gaze settling on the man, a wiry figure with sharp eyes and an expression that seemed permanently set to distrust. She approached him calmly. Mr. Cross, she began, extending her hand. I'm in need of a phone to contact my office. Cross looked at her hand but didn't take it. And who are you contacting? He asked, his voice low and clipped. My assistant, she replied evenly. I was left stranded at the airstrip nearby. His eyes narrowed. Stranded, you say? And how did that happen? Victoria held his gaze, refusing to flinch under the weight of his scrutiny. I was removed from my flight under questionable circumstances. Cross leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smirk. Questionable circumstances, huh? Well, ma'am, phones here aren't free, and neither is trust. The tension in the room thickened. The other patrons had stopped pretending not to listen, their gazes now openly fixed on the interaction. Victoria felt the familiar heat of their judgment, the unspoken questions they were too polite or too cowardly to voice. Mr. Cross, she said, her voice steady, I have no intention of causing trouble. I simply need to make a call. Cross's smirk didn't fade. Trouble has a way of following certain people, doesn't it? It was a statement more than a question, and its meaning was clear. The air in the room grew colder despite the midday sun streaming through the windows. Before Victoria could respond, the door swung open, and Amina burst in, her face flushed with urgency. Miss Harper, she exclaimed, clutching a small, battered cell phone. The villagers, they've managed to get a signal for you. Cross's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. We don't need outsiders stirring things up around here, he muttered, his voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. Victoria turned without another word, her steps brisk as she followed Amina out of the cafe. Behind her, the murmurs of the patrons rose like a low tide, their words indistinct but heavy with meaning. Outside, Jamal stood waiting by the truck, the small phone in his hand. It's a weak signal, he said, handing it to her, but it should be enough. Victoria dialed quickly, her fingers moving with precision despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The line crackled, and then a familiar voice answered. Victoria, Kevin, her assistant, sounded both relieved and frantic. We've been trying to reach you. What happened? I'll explain everything later, she said. For now, I need you to prepare a press statement. This isn't just about me. It's about what's happening everywhere. Kevin's tone shifted, sharpening. Understood. I'll start drafting immediately. And Victoria, there's been a video circulating. A passenger on your flight recorded everything. The weight of his words sank in. The confrontation on the plane. The humiliation. The calculated isolation, someone had captured it all. Good, she said, her voice firm. Then the world will see what we've always known. As she ended the call, Victoria felt a new energy rising within her. The obstacles were growing, yes, but so was the resistance. This wasn't just her fight, it was the fight of every person who had ever been pushed to the margins. Silenced, or dismissed, Jamal watched her closely. What now? He asked. Victoria looked toward the horizon, where the dirt road stretched back toward the airstrip. Now, she said, we make sure the truth has no place to hide. The journey ahead would not be easy. But as Victoria climbed back into the truck, the whispers of the town faded behind her, replaced by the steady rhythm of resolve beating in her chest. Each challenge had been a step deeper into the heart of the struggle. And she knew the hardest battles were still to come. But the weight of injustice had taught her one undeniable truth: the greater the pressure, the sharper the blade. By the time Victoria Harper returned to the main airstrip, the day had ripened into an oppressive heat that shimmered on the horizon. The faint hum of an approaching aircraft grew louder, signaling her impending departure. Yet, even as she prepared for the next stage of her journey, she knew the confrontation she faced had not yet reached its peak. The truck rattled to a halt, and Jamal stepped out first, scanning the empty expanse of asphalt as if expecting trouble. Victoria followed, her movements deliberate, her composure unshaken. She had always known that injustice rarely operated in isolation. It thrived on layers of complicity, each one more insidious than the last. As Victoria stood by the edge of the runway, a sleek black car approached, dust billowing in its wake. The car came to a stop, and from it emerged a man whose presence was as calculated as the suit he wore neatly pressed. Every detail speaking to authority. His name, she would soon learn, was Marshall Crane, a representative of the airline. Crane extended a hand that Victoria did not take. "Mrs. Harper," he began, his tone exuding the polished detachment of someone accustomed to smoothing over inconvenient truths. "I understand there's been some misunderstanding." Victoria regarded him with an unwavering gaze. "Misunderstanding?" she echoed. "That's an interesting word for what's happened." Crane smiled faintly, as if the weight of her words could be brushed aside. "We take passenger concerns very seriously. I'm here to ensure that any grievances are resolved amicably." His words were carefully chosen, but Victoria knew what they really meant. He wasn't here to address her grievances, he was here to contain them. "Amicably?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "Is that what you'd call being humiliated and forcibly removed from a flight without justification?" Crane's smile faltered, but only briefly. "I assure you, Mrs. Harper, the safety of our passengers is always our top priority." "Safety," Victoria repeated, letting the word hang in the air. It's interesting how that word is so often used to justify exclusion. "Tell me, Mr. Crane, whose safety was threatened by my presence?" Crane shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, the sound of another car pulling up drew their attention. Out stepped Lydia, her expression alight with determination. She had refused to let Victoria face this alone, and her presence was a quiet but powerful reminder that complicity did not hold everyone in its grasp. "This can't just be brushed under the rug," Lydia said, stepping forward. "I was there, I saw what happened, and I'm not going to stay silent about it." Crane's composure cracked slightly under the combined weight of their defiance. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Lydia, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter between the airline and Mrs. Harper." "Wrong," Lydia shot back. "This is a matter for anyone who believes in justice." Her words hung in the air, drawing a quiet tension from the workers on the airstrip who had stopped to watch. The confrontation was no longer confined to the small group, it was unfolding as a public spectacle. Crane cleared his throat, his tone hardening. "Mrs. Harper, I assure you, the airline will conduct a thorough internal review of this incident. In the meantime, we're prepared to offer compensation for the inconvenience." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, her silence more powerful than words. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but unyielding. "No amount of compensation can erase what was done. This isn't about convenience, Mr. Crane. This is about dignity." The word dignity landed like a blow, reverberating through the small crowd that had gathered. For a moment, even Crane seemed at a loss, the carefully crafted armor of his professionalism cracking under the force of her truth. Victoria stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You think this ends here? With a check and an apology? But it doesn't. What happened to me happens to countless others. In ways large and small. Every day, it's ignored, dismissed, buried under words like policy and procedure. But not this time." Crane opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lydia spoke again. "There's a video," she said, her tone pointed. "A passenger recorded the whole incident. It's already circulating online." The blood drained from Crane's face. He had clearly been briefed on the situation. But the reality of its exposure was another matter entirely. The tension reached its breaking point as the plane that would carry Victoria back to the city taxied into view. Crane straightened his tie, his voice regaining a semblance of its former polish. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Harper," he said, though his words carried none of the authority they once had. Victoria nodded once, a gesture that carried both dismissal and defiance. She turned toward Lydia, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. Lydia smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me. You need to keep fighting." As Victoria boarded the plane, the weight of the confrontation settled over her like a cloak. Each challenge she faced seemed to strip away another layer of pretense, exposing the raw, unvarnished truth beneath. This was not a single act of injustice but a reflection of a system built to exclude. And yet, within that truth, she found a deeper resolve. Every step forward was a step toward something greater, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. The plane's engines roared to life, lifting her into the sky. Below, the airstrip grew smaller, but the fight ahead loomed larger than ever. Victoria closed her eyes, her hands steady in her lap. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. The mirror had been held up to the world, and the reflection would not be ignored. The city greeted Victoria Harper with a harsh, unrelenting energy. It wasn't the warmth of the village or even the quiet hostility of the town. It was something sharper, more precise, a network of power and prejudice that pulsed beneath the glittering skyline. The fight that had begun in the sky was now landing in offices, courtrooms, and, perhaps most powerfully, the court of public opinion. Her assistant, Kevin, met her at the airport. His usual calm demeanor was tinged with a mix of relief and barely concealed anger. "Victoria," he said, gripping her hand tightly, "you're all over the news. The video, it's gone viral. People are outraged." Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Outrage isn't enough," she said. "Outrage fades. We need action." The car ride to her office was tense. Kevin brought her up to speed. News outlets were requesting interviews. Activists were rallying in her defense. And the airline's initial statement had been met with widespread skepticism. "They're calling it a miscommunication," Kevin said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "They claim Claire acted independently, without orders." Victoria looked out the window, her face calm but her mind racing. "That's their first mistake," she murmured. "They think they can isolate her actions, separate them from the system that created her." When they arrived at her office, the tension in the air was palpable. A small crowd of reporters had gathered outside, their cameras flashing like an unrelenting barrage. Victoria stepped out of the car with the same grace she had carried onto the plane, her chin high, her steps measured. Inside, her legal team was waiting. The conference room buzzed with energy as documents were shuffled and strategies debated. Sarah, the lawyer who had stood by her on the flight, was now fully entrenched in the fight. "They've underestimated us," Sarah said, her voice sharp and confident. "The video alone is damning. But we've also got witnesses, internal memos, and now, this." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were emails from airline executives, obtained through a whistleblower, that revealed the extent of their collusion. Phrases like, "ensure compliance," and "minimize disruption," leapt off the page. Thinly veiled attempts to justify their discriminatory actions. Victoria read the emails carefully, her expression hardening with each line. "They didn't just act on impulse," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This was planned." Kevin chimed in. "Social media is on fire. People are demanding accountability. But the airline's digging in, they're trying to discredit you." Victoria set the folder down and met his gaze. "Let them try. The truth is on our side." The following morning, Victoria held a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, their questions sharp and unrelenting. But Victoria stood at the podium, unshaken. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her voice resonant and clear. "It's about a pattern, a system that allows prejudice to hide behind policies and procedures. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong, like their presence is a problem to be solved." Her words carried weight, not because of their volume but because of their undeniable truth. The crowd listened intently, their cameras capturing every moment. Behind the scenes, the airline was scrambling. Their legal team released a counterstatement, accusing Victoria of misinterpreting the events and claiming the decision to remove her was in the interest of safety. But the statement only fueled the public's anger. Investigative journalists began uncovering more about the airline's practices, disparities in treatment, complaints from employees of color, and a troubling pattern of discrimination that stretched back years. The backlash was swift. Activists organized protests outside the airline's headquarters. Celebrities and politicians voiced their support for Victoria. The hashtag Justice for Harper trended worldwide. But the fight wasn't confined to social media. The airline's strategy grew more aggressive. Anonymous sources began leaking stories aimed at tarnishing Victoria's reputation, claims of entitlement, arrogance, and being difficult. Victoria's team worked tirelessly to counter the attacks. But the strain was beginning to show. Kevin pulled her aside one evening, his voice tinged with worry. "They're trying to wear you down," he said, "to make this so exhausting that you'll back off." Victoria looked at him, her gaze steady. "They don't know me, Kevin. I've been fighting this battle my entire life. I'm not stopping now." As the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The airline's executives were subpoenaed, their private communications scrutinized. Victoria's legal team filed a discrimination lawsuit, citing not only her own experience but the broader pattern of systemic bias the airline had tried to conceal. Each new revelation added fuel to the fire. And with each escalation, Victoria's resolve only deepened. One evening, after another grueling day of meetings and interviews, Victoria sat alone in her office. The city lights twinkled outside, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness she was confronting. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. "I'm with you, every step of the way." Victoria smiled faintly, her heart buoyed by the reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. The challenges were growing, but so was the movement. The contradictions of her world, the promises of equality clashing with the realities of exclusion, had never been clearer. But Victoria knew that the weight of those contradictions could be shifted, even if only inch by inch. She leaned back in her chair, her mind already turning to the battles ahead. This fight was no longer just hers. It was a reckoning for a society that had too often looked away. And Victoria Harper was determined to make sure no one could look away anymore. The courtroom was a battleground, its walls heavy with history. Victoria Harper stepped through its doors with a steady resolve, her every movement watched by cameras and critics alike. This was no ordinary trial, it was a referendum on the quiet, insidious mechanisms of prejudice that had shaped lives and destinies for generations. The gallery was packed. Some had come to bear witness, others to protect their own illusions of innocence. The airline's legal team sat in polished precision, their ranks bolstered by high-priced attorneys whose faces betrayed no emotion. Across the aisle, Victoria's team, smaller in number but fierce in conviction, exuded a quiet defiance. The judge, a middle-aged man with a calm but piercing gaze, called the room to order. The tension was palpable, an unspoken acknowledgement that what unfolded here would ripple far beyond these walls. The airline's lead attorney rose first, his voice smooth and confident. He painted Victoria as a disruptive force, suggesting her removal from the flight was a necessary measure to ensure the safety of others. This was not discrimination, he argued. This was protocol, a decision made in the interest of all passengers. Victoria listened, her face impassive. She had heard these justifications before, cloaked in the language of neutrality but laced with unspoken biases. The words danced around the truth, carefully avoiding the uncomfortable reality that her mere presence had been framed as a threat. When it was time for Sarah to speak, her voice cut through the room like a blade. She laid out the evidence with precision, the video of Claire's dismissive behavior, the whistleblower emails revealing the airline's internal discussions, and testimonies from passengers who had witnessed the incident. "This is not about safety," Sarah declared, her voice rising. "This is about prejudice disguised as policy. It's about a system that allows individuals to act on their biases without accountability. And it's about the harm done to every person who has ever been made to feel they don't belong, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are." Her words hung in the air, unyielding, forcing the room to confront the unspoken truths they had spent lifetimes ignoring. Claire, the flight attendant, was called to testify. She sat stiffly in the witness box, her demeanor a mixture of defiance and unease. Under questioning, she tried to frame her actions as a matter of professional judgment. "I was just following procedure," she insisted, her voice faltering slightly. Sarah's response was sharp. "And what procedure requires a flight attendant to single out a passenger with no evidence of wrongdoing? What procedure justifies humiliation in front of an entire cabin?" Claire hesitated, her carefully rehearsed answers unraveling. The gallery stirred, the weight of her silence louder than any admission. The most damning moment came when the whistleblower took the stand. A young flight attendant with trembling hands. She recounted the directives she had overheard from senior executives. "They didn't want her on the flight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told us to handle it quietly." The room fell silent, the implications of her words sinking in. This was not just about Claire's actions, it was about a system that empowered her. A culture that normalized exclusion and called it standard practice. As the trial progressed, the airline's defense grew more desperate. They attempted to discredit Victoria's character, painting her as entitled and confrontational. But each attempt only reinforced the larger truth. They were not fighting facts, they were fighting her existence. Outside the courthouse, protests swelled. Activists and supporters gathered, their voices rising in unison. Signs reading, "Justice for Victoria," and "End discrimination now," filled the air. A visible reminder that this battle was not hers alone. On the final day of the trial, Victoria took the stand. Her testimony was not a defense, it was a declaration. "I have spent my entire life navigating a world that sees me as a problem before I've even spoken," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "I have learned to carry the weight of silence. To endure the subtle ways people tell you that you don't belong. But this was different. This was a calculated attempt to strip me of my dignity. And I refused to accept that." Her words struck like lightning, reverberating through the courtroom. For a moment, the weight of history seemed to shift, its shadows pulling back to reveal the harsh light of truth. The jury deliberated for hours, each minute stretching into an eternity. When they returned, the verdict was clear. The airline was guilty of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power. The ruling was a resounding victory. Not just for Victoria but for everyone who had ever been silenced or marginalized. As the judge read the sentence, the gallery erupted into applause. Victoria remained composed, but inside, a quiet storm of relief and determination raged. This was a step forward, but the path ahead remained long and uncertain. Outside, the crowd cheered as Victoria emerged from the courthouse. Reporters thrust microphones toward her, their questions rapid and relentless. But Victoria's voice rose above the chaos, calm and unwavering. "This is not just my victory," she said. "This is a reminder that the fight for justice is never over. It is a fight we must carry forward together." The crowd roared, their voices merging into a single, powerful chorus. That night, as Victoria sat alone in her office, the city lights casting long shadows across her desk, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The challenges she had faced were not new, they were as old as the structures that upheld them. But for the first time, she felt a crack in the foundation, a glimmer of hope that the weight of injustice could one day be lifted. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written not just by her but by every person who dared to demand a world that lived up to its promises. Victoria Harper stood at the podium, the lights of the press conference glaring down on her like an interrogation. This moment wasn't victory, it was only another battleground. The courtroom ruling had been clear. The airline found guilty, but the systems they represented were far from dismantled. The applause had faded, the cameras had moved on. But Victoria remained steadfast, knowing that justice was a journey, not a destination. The room was filled with journalists, their questions sharp and probing. Victoria welcomed the tension. It was in this tension that truths long hidden in the shadows could finally come to light. "Mrs. Harper," one reporter asked, her voice cutting through the hum of whispers, "now that the trial is over, what do you hope to achieve? Isn't the ruling enough?" Victoria leaned forward, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "No," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The ruling was a step. But it's not enough. Not when countless others still endure what I did. Every single day. Without the platform to fight back. This is about more than one case. It's about dismantling the structures that allow discrimination to thrive unchecked." The questions continued. But Victoria's responses were unwavering. Behind her, Kevin and Sarah stood watchfully, their presence a silent reminder that this fight was no longer hers alone. Outside the conference room, protests continued, their chants echoing through the city streets. Justice for all. But even as the movement grew, so too did the resistance. Victoria's office had been flooded with hate mail, thinly veiled threats mixed with accusations that she was stirring the pot, pushing too hard, or making everything about race. She read each one, not to internalize their poison, but to remind herself of the work that still needed to be done. The next challenge came swiftly. The airline, reeling from its loss, had filed an appeal. Their legal team aimed to drag the case out, to bury Victoria in endless bureaucracy, hoping that time and exhaustion would wear her down. They think they can outlast us, Sarah said during a late-night strategy meeting, her voice tinged with frustration. They want to make this so tedious, so draining, that we'll let it go. Victoria nodded, her expression calm but resolute. Then we don't let it go, she said. They want to fight? We fight harder. The appeal process was grueling. Depositions were revisited, new witnesses called, and the airline's lawyers doubled down on their narrative, painting Victoria not as a victim but as a disruptor. She's exploiting the system, one of their lawyers declared during a televised interview. This case was never about justice, it's about attention. Victoria watched the segment from her office, her jaw tightening. Exploiting the system, she repeated to herself, as if the system hasn't been exploiting people like me for centuries. Kevin walked in, holding a stack of letters. You might want to see these, he said, placing them on her desk. Victoria flipped through the messages of support, stories from others who had faced similar injustices. A young black woman wrote about being denied a promotion despite being more qualified than her peers. A middle-aged man detailed his experience being targeted by police for fitting a description. Victoria's resolve hardened. They think they can discredit me, she said, but this isn't just my story. It's theirs, and they won't silence all of us. Outside the courtroom, the protests grew louder. Community leaders joined the movement, organizing town halls and forums to discuss broader issues of systemic racism. Victoria attended every one she could, listening as people shared their pain and their hopes. This is what they fear, she said to Lydia one evening, after a particularly emotional forum. Not the trial, not the verdict, this is coming together, speaking out. The appeal dragged on for months, but the pressure on the airline only increased. More whistleblowers came forward, exposing deeper layers of misconduct. Journalists unearthed stories of employees being silenced, customers mistreated, and policies crafted to exclude rather than include. By the time the appellate court upheld the original ruling, the airline's reputation was in shambles. Executives resigned, stock prices plummeted, and industry-wide changes were forced into motion. But Victoria wasn't finished. She launched a nonprofit, Dignity in Action, aimed at providing resources for those who faced discrimination but lacked the means to fight back. The organization grew quickly, its mission resonating with people across the country. At its inaugural event, Victoria stood before a packed auditorium. The audience was a mix of ages, races, and backgrounds, united by a shared desire for change. This isn't just about what happened to me, she began. It's about every moment of quiet exclusion, every instance of being made to feel less than human. It's about a society that promises equality but delivers it unequally. And it's about us demanding more, refusing to settle, and building something better. The crowd erupted into applause. But Victoria's expression remained steady. She wasn't here for applause. She was here for action. Months later, Victoria received a letter from a young boy. He had seen her speak at a school event and had been inspired to write about his own experiences being bullied for his skin color. I didn't think anyone cared, he wrote, but now I see that people do. Thank you for fighting for people like me. Victoria held the letter in her hands, her chest tightening. This was why she fought, not for herself, but for the countless voices that had been silenced for too long. As she stood on the balcony of her office that evening, the city spread out before her. Victoria felt a quiet sense of purpose. The challenges had been relentless, the road exhausting, but the journey was far from over. Racism, she knew, wasn't just in the obvious acts of hatred. It lived in the spaces in between, in the unspoken assumptions, the quiet exclusions, the systems that punished without reason. And it was in those spaces that she would continue to fight. This is only the beginning, she thought, her gaze steady. The city lights flickered like stars, each one a reminder of the light that could pierce even the darkest shadows. The struggle wasn't over, but Victoria Harper was ready for whatever came next.